Cellular respiration, of course, is the process of converting glucose into energy. So if we write the word equation, we've got glucose plus oxygen. So it's the combustion of oxygen. It's a burning reaction or oxidation. So glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide plus water and energy. Now, that energy, the whole purpose of cellular respiration is to provide energy. Now, that energy is in the form of ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. And if I draw a stylized version of that, we have adenosine is actually made up of two parts, an adenine amino acid and a ribose sugar, but we'll just call it that as adenosine, because the real interesting part is the fact that there's 3 phosphates. So that's why it's called triphosphate, adenosine triphosphate. And it's this, or each of these bonds is a high energy bond, but this particular last one is actually really, really important for us. So lots of energy is stored in this final bond here. Because what the body does, essentially what cellular respiration does, is about recycling ATP. So essentially the process of cellular respiration, it's taking ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and taking 3 phosphates and putting them together as ATP. So that's when it's in its high energy state. Now that goes around the cell to where the ATP is required, and the process is reversed. So ATP breaks down into ADP and P, and that energy is released to do all of the cellular functions. And then the low energy ADP then goes back to be recycled in the process of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is all about harnessing the energy in glucose to form ATP. Now, in terms of cellular respiration, it's a multiple step process. Multiple steps, very, very complex, and it's controlled by enzymes. Now, so when you think about it, we're actually burning glucose, but we're doing it in such a controlled manner that the body's not on fire. Alright, so what we're going to do is step through, next thing I could tell you is that cellular respiration can actually occur with or without oxygen. With oxygen, it's called aerobic respiration. Okay, this is with oxygen. And it's called anaerobic respiration when there's no oxygen. So this is like humans do anaerobic respiration, say like doing a 100-meter sprint, or maybe swimming 50 meters across the pool without taking a breath. There's not enough oxygen, so we actually need to use a different pathway. Aerobic respiration is far more efficient. We produce far more ATP, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay, now, so what's common about both of these processes is the first step. So we're going to talk about aerobic respiration now, but the first step is common for all respiration. The first step is called glycolysis. And this occurs in the cytoplasm. Obviously, a key input of glycolysis is that we need glucose. So we know glucose is C6H12O6. So that means that glucose has got 6 carbon atoms. So let's go ahead and count those, see, make sure I've done it the right way. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, okay. So we've got 6 carbons. And the process of glycolysis, so lysis means to split, and gly means glucose. So we're talking about the process of splitting glucose. We split it into 2 molecules, each with 3 carbons. And that molecule is called pyruvate, which is the first step in, which is the next step in our aerobic respiration process. The output of glycolysis is 2 ATP. So some energy is released, but not a tremendous amount of energy at this stage. So we've got pyruvate, and we're just going to take one of the pyruvates and follow that through the process. The next step is an intermediate process, a link reaction, which we're not going to worry ourselves about. But at this stage, this is where the mitochondria comes in. So this is where we start to go into the mitochondria. Mitochondria. Okay, so we've got a little link reaction here, and then the next main part of the process is a cycle called the Krebs cycle, or you also see it called the citric acid cycle. So it's as the name suggests, it's a cycle, so it goes around and it continues to recycle with inputs and outputs. So our input is the intermediate that we had from this link reaction. It's called acetyl coenzyme A, but you don't need to worry about that. That's our input for the Krebs cycle. And we go around the Krebs cycle and we get some outputs. So one of the key outputs, from the Krebs cycle, we get some ATP that gets produced. Again, another 2 ATP. So still not very much. All of this work, and so far we've only got 4 ATP. I might just make a point that this occurs right in the middle of the mitochondria in what's called the matrix. So if I draw a mitochondria here, and of course we've got our folded membrane, is called the matrix. This is the matrix here in the middle, and this membrane, this inner membrane, is really important for us as well for the next part, and that's called cristae. Okay, we don't need that right yet. Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix. A little bit of ATP, but big deal really. The most important output of the Krebs cycle is high energy electrons, and we also have protons. But so hydrogen ions, but of course hydrogen ions, hydrogen is 1 proton, 1 electron. You get rid of the electron, you've just got a proton. So this is what we've produced, is high energy electrons and protons. Now these are carried, they're picked up and they're carried to the next part of the process in energy carriers. 2 energy carriers, NADH, and the other one is called FADH. So that's another story, but essentially they just take these high energy electrons and hydrogen and protons that are produced through the Krebs cycle, and they take them down through to the next part of the process, which occurs in the cristae. So all the way around this highly folded membrane is where it's going to occur. And this is really what sets aerobic respiration apart from anaerobic respiration, is this next part, because this is where we produce most of the ATP. And this is a process called the electron transport chain. Okay, so these electrons that we're talking about are these high energy electrons, and they're transported through a chain of steps, and it's through that process that releases all of that ATP. So the output here is quite a substantial amount of ATP. It's an additional 28 ATP, so that's really quite significant. Now we're talking about 28 additional ATP, so that means we've got a total, in ideal conditions we can have up to like 36 ATP being produced, so a couple along the way and a substantial amount through the electron transport chain. So as I mentioned, it occurs in the cristae. So if I can just briefly show this process, it's pretty cool. So this is the plasma membrane of the cristae. It's got a number of enzymes through the it's got a whole heap of enzymes here, and a really, really important one here at the end. I might draw it, I don't know, kind of like this. Okay, it's probably not quite right, but something like that. All right. So, all of those electrons and protons, they are going to be pumped from one side of the membrane to the other actively. So we have a higher concentration on one side than we have on the other. So the high energy electrons provide the energy, so they pay these enzymes, they're the energy to pump the protons up into this other space. So when those protons then go back down via diffusion through a concentration gradient, well, it's through that process it provides the energy to convert the ADP to ATP. So it's a classic example of a membrane, a highly folded large surface area membrane with embedded proteins and embedded enzymes that actually control exceptionally important reaction. So it's that process of turning. This enzyme is called ATP synthase, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because it's synthesizing ATP. Now, if we go back right up the top here, what I haven't told you yet is, so if we have a look, so we've got glucose. We know that one of the reactants is glucose, and that comes in right at the start of the glycolysis. What I haven't told you is where we use the oxygen and where the carbon dioxide comes out, where the water comes out. So let's have a look at that now. One of the other outputs of the Krebs cycle is the carbon dioxide. So that's where that comes out. And the other output to the Krebs cycle is the carbon dioxide. But it's the oxygen that we need here in the electron transport chain. We say oxygen is the final electron acceptor. So these electrons go down this electron transport chain, losing energy all the way through, and then they need to be picked up here at the end. So this is when we have oxygen that accepts the electrons and those those protons, those H plus ions, and so takes the oxygen and the hydrogen and forms water. So oxygen accepts those electrons and protons and forms water. So one of the other outputs of the electron transport chain then is H2O is H2O, and a really important input is oxygen. Okay, so interestingly, oxygen doesn't come into it till right at the very end, but you can see why it's worth having that oxygen, because we have such a large high yield of ATP when we have, but you can see why it's important to have oxygen, because we have such a high yield of ATP when we have oxygen present. This is aerobic respiration.